Hi, my name is Adnan Mahmutovic, and this is Love and Is This Contents podcast. Today's special guest is Mohsin Hamid, who is one of my favorite writers and also a very good friend. He is, well, in my world, he doesn't need an introduction, but I think I really want to say a couple of things about him. So Mohsin is an author of a lot of novels, starting with Moth Smoke, and then his second novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which was probably one of my most favorite kind of books of all time, which was also turned into a movie, and a number of other books such as How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, Exit West, and his latest is The Last White Man. There is also a collection of essays, a really excellent collection of essays called Discontents and Its Civilizations. So Mohsin, you are welcome to Love and Its Discontents.
Thank you.
So we are here, we have two places connected through technology, a little bit like in your Exit West, where, the world's spaces are connected through these doors. And here we are, you're in Pakistan, I'm in Sweden. So, but we are in one place. My first question is, and it's a big question, but I really want to start with this. What is love for Mohsin Hamid?
That's a interesting question. It's so many different things, I suppose. There's, in a way, when you ask sort of what is love, it's like asking, what is the divine, or, what is the universe, or, what is the meaning of life? These are things that we can sort of approximate to and allude towards and give metaphors for. But we struggle to simply say that love is this or love is that. It might be easier, instead of saying, what love is to, begin with why love matters. We live in a world where increasingly, in so many places, we find ourselves cut off from connections that human beings have enjoyed really since the beginning of our emergence, as a species, in the last 100,000 years. So people are living far from their families. They're living far from their, clan or tribe. Those ideas have broken down in much of the world. We are seeing family transformed, splintering in many cases. Religion, transformed in many cases, disappearing or reconstituting as a almost purely political force, as opposed to something that's addressing spiritual questions in any kind of inclusive way. And above all, we're living in a time where the market is so dominant in so much of the world. And the logic of the market is the logic of self-interest, that if we maximize the utility connected to our self-interest, we'll be living a good market life, and that this is the only rational life. And so self-interest is magnified to a degree, culturally, economically, socially, that is perhaps unprecedented. And this presents us with a challenge, which is that the self is temporary. The self ends. And so we confront this crisis, which is, what do I do in a time where self-interest is everything, and therefore the self is everything, in the face of the knowledge that the self doesn't endure? And I think that this is, in a sense, where love comes into it. Love is this capacity that people have to feel a connection to someone, something else, and to transcend the self in a way. It seems innate to our species. Most people, almost all people, seem to feel or able to feel love, and I think there's probably very good reason for that. Now, of course, every one can feel connected to something, but where we can begin to distinguish that connection from love, I suppose, is that there is the connection which is a kind of acquisitive connection. I'm connected to this thing because I want to possess this thing, and sometimes we call that love too. I love you means I want you to be my wife or my girlfriend or my whatever. But I think the deeper notion of love, which is not necessarily an idea of acquisition, is a desire for the object of our love to somehow flourish, irrespective of what happens to us. And that, you could say, non-possessive type of love, which is a love in which the ego and the self is somehow diminished, is something that has existed in every cultural domain. It exists in every literature. In Pakistan, where I'm sitting right now, it's of course very pronounced in Sufi literature, but this occurs really all over the world in all different phenomena. And I think, what is love? Love is many things, but why are we talking about it? I think because, love is something that we can feel that allows us to be less imprisoned by the temporariness of the self. And that's what I think is quite interesting about it.
And that resonates with a lot of things that I've been thinking about and exploring in the podcast itself, but also generally in my life, in my teaching, when I teach stories and so on. And I think you touched something here which is really interesting, and that is this kind of a transition of how love is changed in our time. How it has become. You talk about possession or ownership and the market. So this is something I see in quite a lot of your books, where the economy clashes with love, where global capitalism clashes with love, and love becomes a commodity, a currency, means to something, and kind of it establishes or reaffirms the ego in many ways, and you see that as a kind of a antithesis to maybe what love should be, really.
Yeah, I think so. I think we are running into what feels like the limits of a particular, worldview. This worldview that the market is somehow going to make us free. Now, that's not to say that the market doesn't have its uses, and that markets can't be, quite helpful. But I think the fetishization of the market, which has occurred in the last, in my lifetime, really the last half century, but particularly the last quarter century, is clearly now beginning to falter. We are seeing, after the end of the Soviet Union and the supposed triumph of the market, the excesses that brings in terms of inequality, in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of the debasement of democracy, dehumanization of our fellow human beings, anxiety, so many things. And so I think we are beginning to take seriously the question of, what else is there? What other ways might we have? And love, I think, is quite interesting when we think about this, is because love is as a concept something that is open to anyone, in a way that God or the divine or the soul, or any sort of religiously or culturally specific mode of talking about these questions isn't. But anybody, whether they're Buddhist or Muslim or Hindu or atheist or Christian or Chinese or Pakistani or American or Swedish, can, in a sense, enter into a conversation about love. And so partly, I think, as we begin to reformulate questions of, how should we live? What should our world be? How should we organize our societies? It's useful to talk about these things. And in fact, it's almost absurd not to talk about them. Because, if you ask people what matters to them in life, I would imagine for the vast majority of people, love will be one of those things. And of love, of course, romantic love is only one aspect of that, right? People can have a love for a tribe. People can have a love for the species. People can have a love for those less fortunate than themselves, or for literature, or for whatever. But this feeling is so central and so marginalized. It's as though we inhabit a world designed by a human perspective that is so skewed away from the median or mean human, and we're chafing up against it. If you've been to Silicon Valley, it becomes very apparent, right, as you go around and talk to people, that this is not really a representative sample of people from around the world. It's a very engineering-oriented place. It's a very money-oriented place. It has a disproportionate share of impact on the world. But in so many ways, one encounters really compressed ideas of the human emotional span, really attenuated visions of wisdom. It's as though one tiny corner of how people are is having this huge impact on how people all over the world are supposed to be. Just as, for example, Wall Street is itself, not the most typical place, and yet has such a huge impact. So I think opening up conversations that people prefer to have in terms of GDP per capita, or eyeballs and attention span, or the value of an IPO, in different terms, including terms like, what does this mean for love? What does this mean for human connection? What does this mean for human attraction to society or others? I think is a very useful antidote, really, to some of the skewed direction in which our species is being led.
That's quite right. I mean, there is that sense that a lot of these things which you listed as being major topics, major issues at stake. You mentioned all the big ones, ethnicity, race, nationality, money, ideologies, all those things seem to me to work reductively in relation to love. So the way you put it is that love seems to be like the lowest common denominator. Like it's something we all have in common, but then when we zoom in, when we claim ownership, we do it by the means of these other things. So love of the nation, love of the ethnicity, or love of this and that. So there is a series of reductions going on, and those are in some cases that you mentioned, they seem to have been blown out of proportion. Rather than recognized as being reductions of this all-encompassing thing, they become like the most important thing, or they are, as you said, the Wall Street or the Silicon Valley or whatever it is. I mean, these things suddenly people talk about them a lot more, and I was actually thinking of the way the word love, even, or the concept of love, when you use it in an ad, like, oh, I love my Nikes, or I love my coffee, the kind of reduction that happens there, as opposed to, love as something uplifting, something that connects us. So you can see how love is used because it is a common denominator, but in that act, in that selling of it's reduced very much to that functionality of it.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that sort of thing. So so much of the contemporary attention economy is based on figuring out truths about human beings and then exploiting them to sell stuff. So, for example, one truth is that we disproportionately will give our attention to threats. So we, if we ignore a tasty strawberry, we'll probably survive to find another strawberry. But if we ignore, something that might be a tiger in the trees, we might not survive. So therefore, the possibility of threat is something that our species, like every species, prioritizes. And so, given that we are wired this way, our media environment is configured to continuously bombard us with a sensation of threat, that people are out to get us. The world is very dangerous, and people hate us, and we must band together, and we must do this and that. And so we are, in a sense, anytime you turn on your computer or your phone, you start looking at social media, or you look at the, internet and start browsing the news. It's a very short journey to being, absolutely anxious and terrified, by what is going on. And people all over the world are being, terrified in this way. And similarly, in a sense, when we talk about love, there's the idea that, we have this feeling, and then our buttons are being pushed. Why not make somebody love their shoes? Why not make somebody love, this variety of pornography? Why not make somebody love, whatever it is? And so you take a basic human aspect, a sensitivity to threats, a desire for love, and then you rework it. You sort of take the human machine and treat it like a machine, and you start applying it to other things. Like, oh, the heart is just a pump. Let's have it pump oil. The brain is just an electric system. Let's have it work as a electricity grid. That kind of attitude towards the human may temporarily generate what you want, which is more eyeballs for your product or more sales for your product. But in aggregate, it winds sort of debasing those things and resulting in very pernicious responses. So because people are so anxious and have been made so anxious, the feeling of fear is resulting in the desire all over the world for somebody to come along and let us not be afraid, protect us and take the fear to somebody else. Let's make other people afraid. Similarly, the desire to repurpose love is resulting in this kind of bottled up love that is desiring expression. So if you tell people not to love their countries, their tribe, they're this, they're that, you have two options. One is you can say, love the person in front of you, love your fellow human beings, love the earth. And how we actually do that? What would that actually mean? We very rarely get very far into that conversation. Instead, we're told, love your shoes, love your apartment. And because those alternate narratives are really just to sell us something, they don't really meet the need, and the need will then find a way to get expressed. And so we see, in societies that have supposedly transcended these issues, suddenly the return of race, the return of ethnicity, the return of nationality, the return of my tribe against your tribe, my kind of person against your kind of person, my love for my kind of person, and defined as a kind of hatred for your kind of person. So I think that is the sort of catastrophic situation we find ourselves in, and to address it, we're going to need to go back to these ideas and to think, how might they be repurposed? For example, if you think of migration, a topic I'm sure we'll come to later, one thing is to say that I'm a native and you're a migrant and I should hate you. But another narrative might be to say that everybody's a migrant, that to move through time is to experience a kind of migration, and that we can have compassion for our own sense of migration and then extend that compassion to somebody else who is also migrating. A fundamentally different approach, but one that isn't really selling you anything, and has to be, made in a different way.
I agree. And it's almost like I'm thinking of love as a form of migration, as a movement through time, movement towards someone. Because you mentioned this focus on the self. And I think in our time, we tend to say, oh, well, you need to have a stable self. You need to have a self which then loves someone or does something or buys something and so on. So there's like an atomist view of the self. Whereas when I'm thinking back, for instance, maybe the Sufis that you mentioned, or just generally kind of traditionally, there is more of a sense that there is no such thing as a self, but rather the self is created through connections, through love. So it's only by, talking to you that I become myself. It's only by loving you, my family, whoever, that I am kind of, my selfhood is constantly kind of migrating and being created. And that's a much healthier view than, because the moment you think that yourself is like this impenetrable atom, then you become protective. Like the moment, the shell is broken or it's hurt, and then you say, oh, well, this is the border on myself. But a lot of times the way you show it in your books is like these borders. Where are the borders? We're kind of traveling constantly, either through space or space and time, in our minds, in our imaginations. It's like these quick moments that we're not even aware of, like these connections. I remember when Changes is thinking of Erica he's in Lahore and they've lost connections, but he's thinking of her. They're very close, although the spatial distance is great between them. So I think that makes me a lot more fun. And I agree with you that there is a sense that that a lot of things are under threat, but we don't conceive of love as being under threat. It's almost like, there should be like a global call for love is threatened. Now all newspapers go, yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing about it also is that, we see, for example, this epidemic of loneliness in much of the world. In the United States, there's all this research that's coming out that suggests that people are lonely to an unprecedented degree. And you'll see, U.S. GDP per capita is among the highest in the world, and the American economy is clearly doing, not clearly doing, but is said to be doing incredibly well. But what does it mean for an economy to be doing well if huge swaths of the population feel they have almost no meaningful connection to any other human being? What are we actually measuring with this GDP, right? What is it? I read, I think that maybe in The Economist, that France has a lower per capita income than almost every U.S. state, except for perhaps the one or two poorest states in the United States, Mississippi or something. But if you go to Mississippi and you compare what appears to be the quality of life in Mississippi, and if you go to France and you sort of look around and think, what is the quality of life here? It's very hard to say that Mississippi feels somehow more wealthy than France, that people in Mississippi are enjoying such a fantastically superior, quality of living. When we know that in parts of, that part of the United States, there's hookworm and ringworm and, unclean water supplies, rampant racism, incredible inequality, things that we associate really with what we, think of as a developing economy, than as opposed to a sort of fully industrialized one, or whatever the terminology that we're currently using is. So I think that we, it would do us well to begin to interrogate, how did we wind up with this way of thinking about the world? Not that economics is important. Of course, economics is important. But it certainly isn't the be-all, end-all. And we don't seem, particularly amazing at even managing it. It's quite clear to anybody who's looking that debt levels all over the world are increasing, but particularly in wealthy societies. Where is this going? What does this mean? Surely this is not a process that can continue forever. What should we be doing? So I think that going back to first principles, what makes a human life worth living, and starting from there is very important. And in the Reluctant Fundamentalist, in a sense, Chingez is this character who is sort of Homo economicus to a certain extent. He's gone to this elite Ivy League university, gets this high-paying job, he's on track to make lots of money, and somehow other things start asserting themselves. He falls in love with this woman, Erica. He has a kind of affection, perhaps love, for his life in the United States. He has this affection, love for this place, Pakistan, that he's left behind. He has some unexamined tribal kind of association with this group of people called Muslims that he hadn't really thought about before. And he finds that, that Homo economicus in his case is really only a pretty superficial description of who he is. These other things become much more salient and start to shape his life. And I think we're seeing that all over the world, whether it's the unwinding of globalization and the imposition of sanctions on one country to the other, and the ratcheting up of borders and boundaries. The idea that how people feel is very, very important, not just how much they earn, is coming back. And I think the last thing I'd say on this is, if we replace love, which seems so, sort of ephemeral, with, food, for example, we know that people have to be fed. We know that if they're not fed, they start to go hungry. All sorts of things begin to manifest themselves. If there is a hunger for nutrition, it begins to play out in some ways parallel to what a hunger for love begins to play out as. People will have to steal, they'll have to rob, they'll have to hoard, they'll have to do all sorts of things. They'll have to fight with their neighbor, they'll have to band together with their neighbor to fight with the other town, they'll have to band together with the town to fight with the other country. So I think very quickly it becomes apparent that we can't really starve people. We can't just tell them, look, buy this thing and forget about eating. So in a similar sense, I think we need to think about human connection and love and the possibilities that contains. And of course, fiction, because, fiction is a very interesting, written fiction is a very interesting form in that it does establish a connection between people, across distance. And unlike some of the other forms like television or cinema, it's two individuals who are connecting. One person who wrote this book and one person who's reading this book. The experience is not that of 100 people making a film and 100 people in a cinema watching the film, or even 100 people making a TV show and one person watching the TV show. It's one writer and one reader. It opens up the possibility for a connection that sometimes can feel not like love itself necessarily, but on a dimension that isn't entirely removed from love, which is why in so many traditions, these types of questions have been explored, through literature, whether it be poetry or religious texts or the novel.
That's quite right, and especially when I think back to the Reluctant Fundamentalist. I mean, all of your books are just generally books, but what you're saying is like there is this Yeah, the Reluctant Fundamentalist is in the dramatic monologue. So it's two people talking to each other, but you as a reader are even more invited to this intimate conversation with the protagonist, with the narrator. And as you say, it's not, it is like one-on-one. It's a lot more intimate. You imagine someone is speaking directly to you. And you are kind of called to a conversation. Either you refuse it, or you don't talk, you don't read the book, or if you do, then you are necessarily a part of that conversation, and you're in it, whether or not you're in it. It goes the way it goes, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an amazing thing because literature is so weird. Like love itself. What is it to read a book? We think of it as this very normal thing because we see it happening around, and many of us who are of an older generation, did it. Younger people, I think, sometimes struggle with reading a print novel or print book just because of what's happened to attention, and the feeling that attention has been chopped into small bits, and it sort of has been hyperlinked out into different directions. And so the idea of sitting for a few hours with this pulped, wood and ink in your hands, just staring at it, can be strange. That said, it is very strange. What is happening when somebody is reading a book, right? They're staring really at this sort of, wood, and having a profound hallucination, for many hours. That is one of the most bizarre things that people do. Your dog watching you read a book, is either very perplexed. Why is this person, just staring at that thing? It's not that interesting. I've smelt it and it doesn't smell like much, and I've looked at it, it doesn't do anything, and there he is.
Good.
Now, on the other hand, a dog might, in fact, find it entirely appropriate because dogs, perhaps in their own dog, mental state, go into these reveries where they've, smelled some urine on a nearby tree, and they are drifting into their own, wonderful, fantastic emotional experience, which we can't have access to. But so maybe dogs think, oh, of course, this is just I know exactly what this guy's doing. But it is strange. Now, why do we do this? And it is, I think, different from a film or a TV show, because a film or a TV show is a simulation of the world. It's still there's stuff moving on that screen that looks like the world. There's sounds coming out of the screen that sound like the world. Of course, different and artistically modified, etc., but somehow more like the world. But the book just isn't. The book is something completely and utterly different. And so that weirdness is of incredible importance. The fact that we can enter into this hallucinatory state while holding this wood, inscribed with strange symbols that come from the mind of another person. That tells us something very interesting about human beings, what we are capable of. We think that the act of writing a book is a big deal. Oh my God, you've written a book. Oh, fantastic! Wow, that's amazing. Or what a waste of time. I mean, it depends on how you feel about writing books. But when I was a young person, I thought, writing a book would be just this great thing to do, and so I really, was impressed with the idea that a human being could write a book. I never stopped and thought of just how impressive it is that a human being can read a book, which is in fact an equally or perhaps even more impressive act. That somebody can stare at this wood and have such a profound experience, which they are almost entirely generating themselves, right? The book is a kind of series of prompts, but it's not doing much. It's just sort of sitting there, pulped wood with some ink on it. The person reading it is the one who's generating so much. And in that sense, I think there is something similar to love. In other words, it's not necessarily the beloved which is doing a lot in love. It's not that the universe or your girlfriend or your son or whatever is doing something, to create the love. I mean, of course, the universe is beautiful and your girlfriend is wonderful and your son is charming and whatever. They're doing something. But I don't think it's necessarily what they are doing that is the more interesting component. Instead, what's interesting is what you are doing, how you are generating this incredible hallucinatory experience, transformative, which is love. And how similar that is to reading a book, where again, this incredible thing is being generated by the reader. And so I do find that that books are quite an interesting place in which to explore this. Almost more so in terms of what readers do than what writers do. But as far as what writers do, if what I'm saying is a characterization that sort of makes sense, then giving or writing books that give space for readers to have their own hallucinatory experience, rather than imagining that somehow I am solely responsible for generating that experience, becomes important. And that, in a sense, suggests particular kinds of writing. How might one write to do this? And in my case, certain choices in terms of leaving things open, letting readers really make their books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is that this is the reason why I think when someone tells you, I love your book, that you do think that's genuine, that they're not bullshitting you. They're real. When they say that, it's a genuine experience of a kind of, as you said, weird intimacy that was established in the act of reading. And as you say, yes, definitely they are doing the work, but also the fact that you as a writer tried to create that intimacy through those, you worked hard at putting those words together, to open the space for the possibility of that intimacy. I remember, like, my first story. I think if I didn't have this reaction to my first story that was published in the United States, that was that was probably 2005, where the editor from North Carolina, this small village in North Carolina, understands my story about Bosnian refugees and my life, like in Sweden, at such a kind of fundamental level, is, as you say, it's absolutely stunning, and it's such a miracle. And I never thought that was possible. And the fact that it actually happened tells me, as you say, a lot about the human condition, that this is at the core of what we are as human beings. It looks absolutely weird. It cannot be explained by anyone in the Silicon Valley or as a kind of engineering experiment, but it's very, very real.
Yes.
And that's why I feel like when someone tells, if I tell you, I love the Reluctant Fundamentalist, that I mean this, the kind of very core of it, because it transformed me in the ways that I didn't see possible or expected.
Well, and also I suppose that is that when somebody says they love this book, they aren't saying only or even primarily that they love what you wrote.
That's right.
What they actually are saying is, I love what happened to me.
That's right.
When I read your book.
Yes.
Which is, of course, so much like love in other aspects of life, right? Which is that, when we say we love someone, it's only partly that we love, them.
That's right.
We also just love this thing that we have with them. That this person is makes us feel this thing, and that they bring out this feeling in us. And so, we love something that is neither ourselves nor them, but in some strange way, something that comes into being jointly, from us. We love in a way a kind of relationship, which of course is what reading a book is. Reading a book is a relationship. It's a relationship that happens on your own, but it still is a relationship between what you hallucinate and what somebody has presented to you as a starting off point for that hallucination. So yeah, I think that is very true.
Would you then connect love to narrative and love to love stories? I've been operating a lot with this notion that love stories give love a bad name because a lot of love stories actually end up, in a lot of negative stuff. That's
Absolutely.
what makes them more exciting. Yeah. But if you make a connection between love and narrative as such, like do they exist without each other and how does it work? Yeah. What do you think?
So my daughter came in as you were asking this question. So if you hear any sound in the background, that was the sound that you'll hear.
No worries. No worries.
But so I think in some ways, how one writes and what a narrative is, in a sense, is a kind of courtship, right? That, if you think of sort of Sufi poetry and you think of, the sort of iconic figure of, let's say, Rumi, who 800 years ago is writing these love poems, very often, to or about his beloved Shams. And Shams, of course, is this man that Rumi had this very strong connection with. But also the love stories that Rumi is talking about feel that they transcend just that particular pairing, and that Rumi is in fact talking about his relationship with the divine and each of our relationships with our beloved. But it's quite clear that there's a kind of courtship underway in Rumi's poetry. And in so much of Sufi poetry, which is directly addressed to the beloved. Now, in much other writing, there isn't this sort of direct form of address to the beloved. And yet, there still somehow is. In a sense, the reader can always be thought of as the beloved, right? The reader is always this person with whom a relationship is sought, and that relationship comes into being between reader and writer. And that how we use narrative, how we use language, how we use all the tricks and tools at our disposal, plot, imagery, metaphor, illusion, whatever it is, in a sense, are all parts of that courtship. And every writer does it in a different way. And every writer in each book will change how they do it. But I think being aware of that is something that happens to varying degrees. For some writers, the awareness that there is the reader, that there is the beloved out there, and that one is addressing that reader and that beloved is very much in the front of one's mind. And for others, it perhaps isn't so much the case. Although if you talk about it with them later, they say, yes, I can see how you would think of it that way. But in the moment of writing, they aren't thinking in those terms. Neither of those is a better or worse way of doing it, but the former is closer to what I think of when I'm doing it.
Oh yes, that is so amazing. I love this the way you kind of teased it out, and I keep thinking, because you have repeated the word beloved so many times in different a lot of times in connection to the beloved in terms of Sufi poetry, but just beloved also as someone you love, it designates a person or God or whatever is the object of your desire, of your love, like your directionality, like the way which you are directed towards outside yourself. And the reason I'm thinking of the word beloved is because it seems to me that there is a scene which dramatizes a lot of things which you've been talking about, and it's from, I think, our favorite writer, Toni Morrison, who was your teacher once upon a time, right? In the States, yes. And in Beloved, her famous novel, what we have is this very, it shows this, in the most beautiful but also horrible way, how ownership affects love, because the slaves are owned and everything becomes a form of possession. So she plays a lot with ownership. You don't own yourself. You don't own your love. You don't own your children. You don't possess them. Then she becomes kind of possessed by the ghost. And, there is a lot of play with that. And she asks this question, well, how do we even love in a world like this, which has been entirely shaped by the market, by economy, by usefulness of human beings. What is even a human being in this situation? So the scene which kind of contrasts to that, and here I think is the example of the speaker speaking to someone, calling, trying to establish this intimacy. I think you probably remember the scene with baby Suggs in the woods and the clearing when she is speaking to the slaves, and she is trying to form this kind of community. And she tells them, love your eyes, love your heads, love your arms, love your hearts, love your skin, love your liver, love, she kind of chops up their bodies into parts and say, love this and love that. She instructs them to love these, themselves and together. So it's like, both the small parts and the individuals and community, all these things. I think it is one of the most beautiful scenes in literature. I think it is just stunning in the way it calls love into being and establishes love as the core of a human being.
Yeah, and I think this idea of the sort of reverse butcher. Who identifies, butcher, yes. All the body parts, that's right. Almost clinically, yes. But then makes each of them worthy of love, right? Is that they rehumanizes every single piece. It's I mean, one thing that, in a sense, if you now talk of Toni Morrison and Beloved, which is by many regarded as her masterpiece, and that she also, I think, thought of that way. Once we were having lunch, and she said she saw I had a book sort of hidden underneath my notebook. And she said, "What have you got there?" And it was her novel Jazz. And so she signed it for me, and then she said, "Read Beloved. It's good." And I read it, and of course it was. And interestingly enough, we'd been assigned Beloved as our summer read before we arrived at university. And our first lecture at university was Toni Morrison speaking as a departure point from Beloved. But I hadn't read it at the time, and I had sort of gone to this lecture not having read it. And then I was 3 years later in her classroom, still having not read it.
Still having not read it.
Yeah, and so I finally got around to it then, and of course, it was, as she said, very, very good indeed. And I think that that novel is very much concerned with love. How powerful a force it is, and when it is so brutally, and horrifically, violated by the institution of slavery and its aftermath, what happens, and the kind of ghost story of such a violation of love, when you take people and separate them from the people that they love, and you take people and separate them from their own children, and and how, without, I guess, giving away too much of the book for those who haven't read it, but how a mother is presented with this question of, if her child risks being enslaved after they've escaped, what does motherly love demand her to do?
Exactly.
And so I think in that book is present such a powerful evocation of of what happens when love is thwarted and damaged and prevented and denied to such an extreme extent. What manifests after that? And of course, that's something that we're reckoning with, to this day, not just in the context of the consequences of slavery, but in so many other contexts. In just in the barbarities that we inflict upon each other.
I agree, because that novel with a lot of extreme situations, it really draws your attention to this dichotomy between what she calls thick love and thin love. And it seems to me that what you said in the beginning and throughout is that we need to go back to the thick love rather than this thin love, which is just a part of the advertising and the way it's been reduced or diluted. I think that's why I love her metaphor, thick and thin.
Yes.
Rather than because it's like something that's diluted, made into just kind of worthless.
Yes.
In a way. Yes. Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you. There were two scenes in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which was so powerful to me in terms of the connection between people, and connection and disconnection. This desire for connection, which is like a desire for food. One scene is when Cengiz is meeting this some kind of a strange figure in a dark alley, and that person looks at him with kind of hate. And that's the moment where he imagined that there was affinity between them because they were both colored, I suppose, or that they were both Asian or something like that. I mean, you mentioned earlier, his discovery of, not all his ethnic, his race, his Muslimness, those kinds of things. Whereas the other person, so Cengiz is thinking, okay, well, I'm connected to that person. I feel this affinity, whereas I'm now disconnected from my fellow Americans. Whereas that person looks at him as an American and kind of dislikes him. So he has this moment like, oh, I'm an American? I'm what am I? Like, what is myself? And this kind of moment of like both connection and disconnection that happens in that moment is so extremely powerful. The other moment is when Erica asks him to, when they're trying to make love and it's not working, and he obviously he desires her so much, in a sense she loves him too, but this sexual act is not. It's simply not working. There is a barrier. There's something between them that's making this joining of two bodies and two souls makes it impossible. And there he suggests that she imagines that he is her former boyfriend. So in a sense, he relinquishes himself entirely. Like it's so almost kind of absolute annihilation of his self. And in both cases, there is connection and disconnection based on like what they imagine to be. And this resonates with me, like in terms of what you said, how we read books, what we imagine the other to be, what they provide, and what we imagine we are delivering in these situations. I wonder if you can just say something about those two scenes, what you were thinking, imagining yourself, or how do you think I find them so disturbing, both of them. Yeah.
So when Chinggez is working and he's in the Philippines and he begins to pick up on the resentment, towards him, and he realizes that this resentment is because of the role that he plays, that he's, working for a particular kind of company, and he's, representing a particular American kind of enterprise, and comes across in a way as a kind of American. What's strange for him is this, identification with the person looking at him. Which in a way you might describe as a bizarre kind of love that lasts for an instant, right? Where you
That's
suddenly
right. Yes.
see through somebody else's eyes who you are.
Yeah.
And this happens, I think, to all of us from time to time. We'll be doing something and somebody will be reacting to us, and we realize that if we were seeing ourselves, we perhaps wouldn't like what we're doing. Why am I talking like this? Why am I acting like this? Children, for example, have a very good way of doing that. As a parent, you're disciplining your child, you're saying something to your child, and your child is thinking, what a jerk. And you're maintaining the, facade of, this is how it will be. But it dawns in your head that, wait a second, I am kind of being a jerk, actually.
Yes.
And, how do
Exactly. Yes.
how do I retreat from this position I've taken without, compromising all moral authority for the rest of my life? The kid is right. And then it comes back to what you said, I think, earlier in our conversation, which is that, the self is a relational quality. It doesn't actually exist independent of other people. That's why when they really want to punish someone in prison, they put them in solitary confinement. Then solitary confinement, the self begins to collapse. And after you do it for long enough, and people, have severe psychological damage. I think that, that this interaction between two people is part of the self. Chinggez sees himself reflected, but also Chinggez, in a sense, is feeling in the reflection some truth, that the mirror is holding up a truth that a simple internal introspection wasn't revealing. That he's being confronted with something that he wasn't really looking at, and in a way, similarly with Erica, there's in that scene. One thing which is happening, of course, is that, as you say, there's a kind of annihilation of the self, that Chinggez is saying, let me be somebody else for you. But there's also, as with every annihilation, or with many annihilations, there's also something is made in the annihilation. And so Chinggez is annihilating a self, which is Chinggez as Chinggez, but Chinggez is also taking on a self, which is Chinggez as this other man, Chinggez as somebody that he is not, Chinggez as somebody that she desires, and perhaps he desires to be. And what does it mean to desire to be someone who isn't yourself? So what we are seeing there is not merely, in a sense, the eradication of Chinggez as a person, but Chinggez being willing to entertain the possibility of eradicating himself and replacing himself with somebody else. So it is unclear to us how much of this desire is entirely from Erica, what she needs, and how much of it is something that Chinggez himself is willing to enter into, because he perhaps desires a kind of transformation of himself too.
I agree, and this is why this scene is so powerful, and I repeat, disturbing to me, because you leave it quite open, as you do, especially in that book, but generally in most of your work. And as you said earlier, the best literature does that. It leaves these things open, so you can't quite decide, how much is this forced upon him, and how much does he actually desire it? How much is he deprived of agency, and how much agency does he have in the act? And that kind of movement between those two is what makes this so. I suppose that's what makes it so disturbing, because it's a little bit like in the existentialist leap or jump, like is someone pushing you, or are you actually leaping yourself? Are you committing suicide? Like what that kind of ultimate freedom, and that literature does this. It gives you that, shows you how much freedom there is in that. So if an author serves you the interpretation, if it's really trying to teach you something by just like explicit, like in an essay, but it's different. Then you can refuse it, you can kind of agree with it and so on. But if it puts you in this situation where you're responsible for it, and like, oh, I could go that way, and I could also go that way myself.
Yes.
It really shows you something about your self. And also the fact that, of course, this is an extreme example where we see there's some kind of a violation going on, but love seems to be moving between those poles. Like, I am trying to build myself, I'm trying to maintain myself, but also I need to sacrifice myself. I need to relinquish myself to an extent in order to have a relationship. So it's like this kind of balancing act, this dance of,
yes. Which is, of course, what readers do when they pick up a book, right? I mean, when a reader picks up a book, in a sense, there is a kind of annihilation which goes on.
Yes, exactly,
the room around you, what's happening in the world, your life until that moment. In a sense, that's annihilated for a few hours, and you enter into this other world. Now, of course, it's a temporary annihilation, hopefully, or partially, but it still is, a kind of annihilation, and we enter into it willingly, and then we emerge from it, somehow changed. And I think, in a sense, that is the power here. We began by talking about the fact that the self ends. And so, the self-ending, of course, is an annihilation. How do we make our peace or become comfortable or reckon with this annihilation? And in a sense, other experiences that open us up to annihilations seem to be attractive to us. Whether that's jumping out of an airplane, whether that's opening a book, whether that's, making love to someone and pretending to be somebody else, or asking to be thought of as somebody else. All of these annihilatory experiences open up, in a sense, possibilities to us, and open up domains. And so, if the traditional way of talking about annihilation was that, well, it's not really annihilation, that after the annihilation comes, the afterlife, or the rebirth, or, the reincarnation, or heaven and hell, or whatever. There is, in addition to all of those ways about thinking of the annihilation, there's also the notion of, in our lived life, what makes the annihilation not an annihilation? Why does Chingis still exist after this moment? Why do I still exist after I put the book down that I'm reading? And so I think this notion of love, it's annihilatory, but also somehow transcendent power, does relate to this fear that we have of mortality, of death, of the end of the self. And it's useful to us in that way. It presents us with a kind of kindred experience to the one that we fear. And we can make a different relationship to the thing that we fear as a result of that.
That is absolutely beautiful. It really kind of connects the two forces, love and death, together. And it's a perfect way to end a really beautiful conversation. Mohsin, thank you so much for this. This was really amazing. I really loved talking to you about these about love and literature. I mean, those were the things that I was so looking forward to.
My pleasure, Nan. I love the conversation as well. It was great to speak to you, and I hope it's not too long till we get to speak again.
I'm also looking forward to having more of these conversations, especially live and
yes,
meetings and
hopefully with famous footballers randomly strolling by as happened last time. Yeah,
exactly. Last time, like I was also thinking like we should have invited Zlatan to this podcast as well, so we have like a chat with Zlatan Ibrahimovic.
Yes.
Incidentally, I just before we started this filming, I just saw a video of this big farewell they staged for him in Italy, showing all the love they have for him.
Yes.
It's really this after a long period of everything he's done for the football and for them, and they were crying and they were smiling, and they were it was such a display of love for this amazing footballer, and we just happened to meet him on the street, right?
Well, let's say we happened to be within a few feet of him. I'm not sure it was quite a meeting, but yes,
it was quite a meeting. Actually, we just jumped in front of him and took a selfie. So, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's why I was kind of thinking, like, seeing this and I'm waiting for our conversations. Like, we should have invited Zlatan Ibrahimovic. It would have been
next time.
Next time, yes, a different kind of podcast. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Bless you, and thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Adnan. Yeah. All the best.
All the best.